Welcome, ladies and gents. This is another episode of Resolving Reality Live. I'm your host, Emmett, the host of the Resolving Reality podcast and the author of the book, Red Pandemic, The Global Marxist Cult. And thank you very much for joining me. I'm back with a bunch of new interviews here, live streams, X Spaces, some other bits and pieces coming up as well. I also got a bunch of interesting interviews with some prominent figures from the Irish nationalist movement over the next few days, so looking forward to that as well. So anyone who joined me last day, I was speaking to Mr. Jeff Nyquist, who is an American author, an author of many different books, and specialist in one of my favorite areas, which is communism, global communism, and so on. Considering everything that's happening, as I always say, this is a very, very important subject, and it's always great to speak to a specialist. I really appreciate it. I always learn in these discussions, and this kind of topic is something that it should be a lifelong learning experience, really, I think. And there's so many different parts to it. But obviously, because of stuff that's been happening recently, we had the whole thing with Epstein and some of the global happenings. So lots to talk about. And we are going out live on X, YouTube, and Rumble, adding some more platforms now shortly. Just getting some things together as usual, up to my eyeballs here. But we'll get there in the end. So if you wouldn't mind, you're watching on X, please do repost, share, all that good stuff. If you're on YouTube, comment, subscribe. I'll monitor here when I have the chance. Also going out on Rumble as well. So yeah, onwards and upwards. So just to bring Jeff on here, I will just switch my views here, and hopefully we can hear Jeff as well. We're kind of doing this on the fly, so enable. Jeff, your mic is now enabled. Welcome to the show. Oh, I think we have the same issue as last time. Maybe it's something to do with the browser. I don't know if you remember that. The browser might not be enabled, or your mic might be muted. So I can't hear you, but your audio is enabled, but it's not coming through. So we might just okay, no worries. What I might do is, Jeff, I can't actually hear you, so while you resolve that, okay, no problem. No worries, might be just the audio in the browser. Okay, so vMix is definitely receiving, but I think it's probably on your end with the browser. It's usually the issue with these. Guests. So whenever you're back on, Jeff, you can talk away there.
It should work now.
Oh, I got you. Yes, welcome, Jeff.
Okay. We're getting a bit of an echo.
Have you got an echo your end from me?
Yeah. No, I'm hearing my own voice coming back.
Okay, no worries. Have you got? Might be something to do with the settings. If I usually go with headphones, but you didn't have the issue last time.
Mm-hmm.
One second. Yeah. Just gonna adjust my own mic here. I'm gonna come through a little bit loud myself. So I'm just gonna drop that down slightly.
Feeding back through your speakers.
Okay. So whenever I'm talking, there's an audio, or
is fix it.
Okay, no worries. Great, good stuff. Yeah, thanks for joining us, folks. For joining in late, please do share this around on whatever platform you're watching on. Going to be chatting away here about a few things. Please do like, share, subscribe, all that good stuff. So how's my audio now, Jeff? All good?
It's all good.
Perfect. No worries. So just probably, I'm just going to think what you can see on your screen now. Can you see the browser page, Daily Mail, and yourself?
Yep, I see it. Epstein's sex empire was KGB honey trap.
Great, no worries. Yep. So I got a bunch of links lined up in the browser, so I can kind of click between them like this on the fly. And, that document you sent me as well. I'll bring myself in now as well shortly. But, yeah, so a lot happening. I'll go back to this one for a moment. So a lot happening this week, Jeff. And I know that the hot topic at the moment is Epstein, and we can talk about a few different things. And it's just, it's just the same pattern all the time, isn't it? There's something that happens, people start to catch on, and then there's like this reaction or response to what's been happening to try to hide the narrative. What was your kind of knee-jerk reaction to the Epstein thing, first of all?
Well, the thing is I'd had a what you call a pre-knee-jerk reaction, but it wasn't a knee-jerk reaction. Look, I always thought that Jeffrey Epstein was KGB going back. I never thought he was Mossad. Look, Ghislaine Maxwell was his, I think we mentioned this, was his business partner. Her father, Robert Maxwell, was a KGB agent, according to the Daily Mail, which is referring to sources in the intelligence services confirming he was recruited by the KGB in the 1970s.
Yep.
So this is known. I'd read this before. I was familiar with who Robert Maxwell was, of course. I also knew I had sources from the former Soviet Union saying that Andropov had set up pedophile networks. It was even controversial within the Central Committee, caused conflict within the Soviet Union, but Andropov was king. He became the successor of Brezhnev. And so this is what they started to establish. You've got stories like the Franklin cover-up in Nebraska in the United States, John DeCamp's book, and there's been other research done on that since, confirming indeed there was something going on in Nebraska back in the late 80s. And of course, we've got the Jimmy Savile, stories out of the UK where you are. And we've also got Ann Lucas's book, Quest for Love, about the pedophile networks on the continent. So who created these? How were they organized? There's a similar pattern in all these stories. And these stories are, she was connected to a network where there was, what was his name? He was arrested in Belgium, and he went to prison. He was sort of Belgium's Jeffrey Epstein back some years back. I think it's almost 20 years ago now. So you've had arrests, but the problem is they say, oh, it's just one guy, right? It's just Jeffrey Epstein, or it's this guy over here. No. You look at the prominence of the people that Epstein was associating with. I mean, Bill Clinton, former president of the United States, Donald Trump, future president of the United States, and he's going to Russia so often that in one of the emails that got released, this guy saying, oh, Jeffrey, you go to Russia so much, I have to believe your parents were KGB, that they raised you to be a KGB agent, right? Because his background is from the former Soviet Union. His family comes from that part of the world. It's his ancestry. But so Jeffrey Epstein, excuse me, meets with Putin in person after Epstein had been convicted for, selling an underage girl into prostitution. So he's meeting with Putin, and there's another scheduled meeting. How many meetings to Putin do we not see in the emails? And by the way, they've only released half of these files. There's another half they didn't release. Why didn't they release them? What's in those files, right? And is who's being protected?
Yeah, this is the thing. And, I suppose, Jeff, we have to cater for people at all levels of understanding and knowledge here, I suppose, to put it politely without making us sound arrogant. But would it be sensible, do you think, maybe not right away, but we should really address some of the history of communist subversion to make people at least aware of what these people are capable of and the sophistications and the things that they've done. I mean, this honeypot traps and getting people involved in degeneracy and so on, in order to coerce them. This is not anything new, is it? As far as I know, it goes right back in history.
Well, intelligence services have used this before, and I'm getting it again.
Oh, sorry.
Intelligence services have used this kind of thing before. And it's but pedophilia underage is, well, look, since the sexual revolution, people accept all kinds of things. Now we've got a president is on his third marriage, right? It became more and more acceptable. I mean, Trump was famously a playboy. I don't think we've ever had anybody who was openly a playboy get elected president before. So what is acceptable? The social mores have changed. So how do how do you get a hold on somebody in a honey trap when they're not going to be embarrassed by a normal having an affair with a normal aged person? You have them involved with an underage person, right? You have it be something evil where it's not normal. Then you have, well, you got to be careful. You don't want to blackmail people, especially once they're president, but you want to have a friendship, a relationship where it's not stated, but you have a loyalty, you have a certain obligation to that person, and that they have done things for you that you enjoy, and they have proven their friendship to you. So you have to prove your friendship back to them. And then you make sure that they marry the right person, perhaps. Why are two of Trump's three wives from former communist countries, from communist families? Why? His first wife was from communist Czechoslovakia, Ivana. And this his one now, she was from a communist Yugoslavian family. They were members of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia, her parents. What does that mean? And of course, we know that Russia is still communist, not in the sense that they openly celebrate communism and this open indoctrination. It's a communist elite that rules the country, communist families, communist organizations. The KGB was the sword and shield of the Communist Party. You think the Communist Party could go away and the KGB could remain? The KGB is nothing without the party. It's the armed party members, the ones that carry the guns for the rest of the party. That's what the KGB is. That's who Vladimir Putin was and is. And they don't have to have the hammer and sickle flag. And they know that most people don't believe in Marxism, Leninism. They only need the people that run the system to believe in it. The other people just have to obey. So they can have this change of the appearances, right? They can change Leningrad back into St. Petersburg. But it's funny, when they invade Ukraine, they put Soviet flags on their tanks and their generals are wearing armbands with a hammer and sickle on them. Why is that? What does that mean? They're putting up statues of Lenin in the oblast they conquer in Ukraine. Why are they doing that? There's a reason.
Yeah, this is it. This is the hidden threat, isn't it, Jeff? And there's so much happening at once. And actually in the book, I did a section how the international revolutionary ideology of communism tends to destroy culture. It replaces culture with its own culture. And, after the Black Lives Matter debacle around 2020 or whatever year it was, I remember that they were tearing down statues left, right and center across the states of all these racist oppressors, the same in the UK. But yet at the same time, I think a party in Germany erected a statue of Lenin. So exactly what you were talking about. But, looking at the Epstein thing, of course, people would find what we're talking about a bit too hard to believe. And, again, because they don't really know the history of this ideology. Yeah. But I suppose the big question is why? Why would the Russia or any of their allies have someone like Epstein involved with them? What's the purpose of this, if it is like a honey trap operation?
Well, let's see. Let's describe Benjamin Gitlow was with John Reed. They were the original American communists. John Reed wrote 10 Days That Shook the World. He was in Russia during the Bolshevik Revolution. He celebrated it. He was present at the formation of the first Communist Party in the U.S. in New York. And of course, then in Chicago, and Lenin said, you got to put them together. Benjamin Gitlow was right there. He wrote a book, For the Whole of Their Lives, recounting this. I think the book came out in the late 30s, if I remember. And Benjamin Gitlow was going to be appointed the head of the American Communist Party by Stalin in the 1920s. But Stalin wanted all the Americans to admit all their errors, which they didn't really commit. They wanted them completely humbled before him in Moscow, and Benjamin Gitlow would not bend to Stalin. So he got kicked out of the party. He was lucky. At that point, Stalin wasn't murdering everybody that balked him. But that was on its way. That kind of treatment was on its way. So Benjamin Gitlow was sort of an outcast from the communists. And so he wrote a very honest memoir about how John Reed himself became disillusioned with the Soviet Union and communism. And John Reed on his deathbed, he said, I don't want to live. He told that to his wife. He was dying of kidney failure. He didn't want to do anything to help himself. He wanted to die because he said he had joined an evil cause. that these people, these Bolsheviks, were evil. And Benjamin Gitlow said that there's a lot of sweet people who believe in socialism. They believe in this ideal, but the leaders are sharks. They have a criminal mentality. And Lenin, it goes back to Lenin. Lenin said, all these intellectuals who read Marx's books, I can't make a revolution with them. People said, well, Lenin, why are you hanging out with these street thugs, these criminals? He said, I can make a revolution with them, right? So it isn't the revolution of the proletariat, it's a revolution of the lumpen proletariat. And Lenin knew. And Stalin was his bank robber. Stalin had a criminal psychology. He was one of those criminals who had a genius IQ and was able to, actually do theoretical work and develop strategies. So these really advanced criminals, why rob a bank when you can take over a country and own all the banks and just rob the whole country? Why not? That's the whole game. Lenin was essentially seemed to believe in a lot of this stuff, and Lenin was probably a psychopath, right? Because he murdered so many people. Marx seemed to have those traits as well, at least a malignant narcissist. And Marx once said, there's nothing more glorious under the heaven than the mind of a criminal. That's one of Marx's quotes. These people admired criminals. Marx's favorite character from German literature was Mephistopheles from Goethe's Faust.
Yes.
About Faust as a guy who practices black magic, and this devil, Mephistopheles, appears before him and offers him that deal with the devil. You can have whatever you want if I get your soul, right? So that's Marx's favorite character. And so then you get to the house that Stalin built. He built it with criminals. The criminals helped, when you read the Gulag Archipelago, the Zeks are the political prisoners. The real criminals were used by the camp administration to control the Zeks, to torture the Zeks, to make the Zeks more miserable than they were before. So it's all in league with the criminals. And then after World War II especially, they started looking at organized crime in the United States. And they did studies and they said, Mao wants to do an opium war against the Americans. We think we can do it. We can corrupt the banks. We can corrupt the elite. By laundering the drug money, that's the big key to it all. We've got instant bribe money. We can make people dirty. And of course, we learned from Prohibition what happens with alcohol. Once alcohol was always very popular with Europeans and European Americans, where most of us are descended from Europeans. Alcohol is big in Europe, and you make it illegal, and you see it immediately became corruption and crime everywhere. This is where the Kennedys got their money from. It's the Chicago police were putting their kids through school this way. So they started Operation Friendship of Nations in 1960, which was Soviet drug trafficking. The Chinese had their own version of it because they went into the drug business at the same time with the same idea, basically. But, they also found with getting into organized crime, they wanted to make common cause with all the mafias around the world. They wanted to see, Mao had this idea, it was called the Yinan Way. Look, we promise to make people rich. They become our allies. We can shoot them later, but they're going to help us get into position to take over different countries. That was the Yinan Way. That was how Mao took over China. He made deals with the, opium growers in China. Opium had destroyed China. He made deals with them. He got in with the triads. Mao was working with organized crime when he took over China. And of course, that organized crime had been with the nationalist government too. But their thing was, we're going to control organized crime. And this was a book by Joseph D. Douglas Jr. called Red Cocaine. He goes into the whole thing from defector sources, where it comes from, how they developed the schools in communist Czechoslovakia to train people in the drug business. They didn't have to be communists, by the way. They just needed to be loyal to their espionage system. But of course, once you get into organized crime, you get into the white slave trade, right? Prostitution. And then Andropov comes along and it's underage prostitution. The ultimate, the atomic bomb of organized crime is child trafficking. And I think we got this Jeffrey Epstein story. I think we've got the key to unlocking the whole thing about why this thing is spread all over the globe. It's in Europe. It's in North America. It's all over the place. We've got the key right there in that story in the Daily Mail. I think that's what we've got.
Absolutely, Jeff. Yeah, very interesting. Some of the overview and just some of the stuff they've been up to in the past, and I'm sure you've noticed how for anyone watching who doesn't really understand this communist movement, they always tend to deflect blame onto other groups. We know that they're against the West. They've always hated this idea of the bourgeoisie and so on. So a lot of them seem to be deflecting the attention onto the royal families and so on. Now, I mean, of course, people can engage in negative behavior from all walks of life. And there certainly seems to be a lot of shady stuff involving with the royals. But I think that they've kind of, again, co-opted this and diverted it into one of their old enemies, and to kind of try to sever any connections and not to kind of bring up the whole Russia or Putin connection. So what's your reaction to that one?
Yeah, well, I think the key is to recognize that how come they're teaching communism in our colleges? How'd that happen? We know the Marxists infiltrate education. It's the first place they go to. Why? To influence the next generation. Because if they can't make a revolution now, they need to change the society. Every generation is one generation from barbarism, because you have to educate your young people. Well, how do you do that? Who does that? It was discovered in 1939 when the Hitler-Stalin Pact, when the Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia got together, people started looking at communism a little differently. They saw it as an ally of Nazism. So the school systems in New York and New Jersey, they uncovered that there was a communist infiltration of the schools. And they had hearings in the state legislatures, in which they brought people forward, and a lot of teachers were fired. They found that is really embedded in New York and New Jersey. Now, World War II interrupted that investigation. It picked up again after World War II when the Cold War started. And you had a period of years where Congress and many state legislatures, they held hearings on communist subversion of their states, of their school systems. I mean, there were 20,000 people dismissed from the federal government who were found to be communists in the 1950s. I think it was the McCarran Act in 1954. So Ed McCarthy was part of that. But it was the House Un-American Activities Committee. It was the House that Whittaker Chambers and Elizabeth Bentley first testified for. The Senate also had these testimonies. So McCarthy was a sort of a celebrity in that. But you had this attack on McCarthy, and you had this discrediting of anti-communism. Where did that come from? And as Louis Boudin's, a defector from the American Communist Party, wrote in 1965, the whole idea of McCarthyism was put forward initially by Stalin. When McCarthy was really starting out in 1950, hot and heavy, Stalin said, we have to create something called McCarthyism. We have to blacken its name. We have to destroy it. We have to prevent because anti-communism is a problem. Then later, several years later, Khrushchev gave a speech, and you can find it in research library of collected, translated speeches of the Soviet leaders. He gave a speech in which he said, anti-communism in America is a problem. So what we need to do is we need to form our own anti-communist organizations in America, run by Americans, of course, that are under our control, where we can change the message, we can corrupt the message of anti-communism. The year after that speech, in 1957, Robert Welch formed the John Birch Society. And if you read the Blue Book of the John Birch Society, Robert Welch said, basically, well, the Soviet Union's not a real threat. We're fighting communism. The real threat is here in the West. And later on, it comes out, and he gives a speech. I think it's the more stately mansion speech, where basically he admits it's the Illuminati, not it's the Western businessmen, the occult elite of the West. And of course, what do the Soviets come up with then? Under Andropov, they create the Satanist baby-killing elite in the West. By penetrating that elite, and of course there were Masonic lodges and there were occult practices, But guess who stole? The Nazis collected records on all the Masonic lodges, on all the occult societies in Europe. They housed it in Vienna. Julius Evola was involved in bringing that together out of Italy. And what happened? The Soviet army captured Vienna. They captured that record, hauled it back to Moscow, where Alexander Dugin was then educated and taught to rifle through it. So they created their own occult movements. They infiltrated the West, and they used it as a mechanism of control. How do they, and if you read or listen to Ann Lucas' testimony in Quest for Love, part of the initiation of these underage girls is they have to kill a baby. And the same thing in the Franklin cover-up. You read the book, The Franklin Cover-Up, and there's two girls put in a shed, and by morning they have to kill this baby or they're going to be killed, right? So you compromise them. They commit a murder. There's no statute of limitations. And then you control them, and then you can traffic them, and you can trust them. They have methods. These are very well worked out psychological methods for controlling and doing things, mind controlling. Imagine the trauma. You are trauma bonding people to you. This is what Jeffrey Epstein's molestation was doing to people. You read the books on Jeffrey Epstein and what he did and how he treated girls and how he would groom them and get them, under his power. It's diabolical, right? And so this whole thing, there it is. Epstein's sex empire was KGB honey trap. Pedophile financier had multiple talks with Putin after conviction, with Russian girls flown in to harvest compromat on world-famous figures. It's pretty black and white. And they're getting confirmation from people in the intelligence services. So why was this? Look at how many years he operated. How was he able to operate so many years in the U.S.? Why didn't the CIA catch on overseas, the FBI here domestically? Why didn't these services catch on to this? Were they caught up in the trap? And of course, if you read the history of the CIA, if you read the deathbed testimony of the former head of CIA counterintelligence, James Angleton, he said, look, the heads of the CIA were liars. He said, you know how I got to be head of counterintelligence? Alan Dulles and 60 of his friends, I wasn't allowed to polygraph them. Why? Because they had done things with Hitler's buddies at the end of the war. That is, they'd enriched themselves. And they thought that the KGB, or they thought the Russians, Soviets couldn't figure that out. So they compromised themselves. They were bad people. Bad people get compromised, and they get owned by who? If I've got the power to send you to prison to destroy your career, and I'm a KGB spy master, what am I going to do with you? I'm going to double you. I'm going to make you do things for me. I'm going to make a deal. Alan Dulles, by the way, was picked as the handpicked assistant of General Walter Bedell Smith when he was head of the CIA. And according to Mark Riebling in the book Wedge, General Walter Bedell Smith was an agent of Russian intelligence. The head of the CIA was an agent of Russian intelligence. Of course, he says this is what the CIA came to think and suspect. So they basically got Walter Bedell Smith out of that job. Eisenhower tricked him to giving up his CIA position. But Alan Dulles was there. And so Alan Dulles was somebody that Angleton said was going to hell. He was going to hell. And Angleton said, we did bad things. These people are liars. And he said, the real problem with Americans is they don't care about secrecy. And of course, their secrets are safe if they're really bad, if the KGB is also protecting them. Because the KGB says, oh, you're bad, we can protect you. We'll make sure that your bosses or the other people don't find out. The best protection is to join the KGB, is to work for them. And that's why the CIA lost at every turn. Why were we the gang that couldn't shoot straight? You think the CIA killed Kennedy? The KGB killed Kennedy. And if there was any CIA involvement, they were working for the KGB. That's the answer. That's the answer that people won't look at. Lee Harvey Oswald was a communist who had defected to the Soviet Union. Why do we have such a need to cover that up and to make up stories that we did it ourselves? Jeffrey Epstein is part of the Jewish Mossad, bankster elite. It goes back to Jacob Schiff, they'll tell you. No, Jacob Schiff was a good guy. He wasn't corrupt. You go back to American presidents, was Hoover, President Hoover, President Calvin Coolidge, was President Harding. Were they involved with underage girls? Were there honey traps run? No, this thing developed. Were the leaders of Europe controlled by these? No, these things developed after the Bolshevik Revolution. These mechanisms of control. How did the communists infiltrate the Catholic Church? How did we get these last two popes? You think these last two popes aren't helping Russia and the communists? Look at what they do. Look at how they're tearing the church apart from within with their ideology, with newfangled Catholicism, twisting the theology around. I mean, can't everybody see it? How did that happen? What are all these stories about Catholic priests and little boys? How did that happen? When did that begin? Right? Did that start under Stalin? Is that when that started? Maybe.
Yeah, there's an awful lot, isn't there, Jeff? And trying to bring people up to speed to the sort of, just the complexity and the history of all this. And we had a little pre-chat yesterday, a little quick chat on WhatsApp about some different things. And this obviously it's amazing that, as you said, they were able to do something like this, keep it going. And obviously Epstein himself, whether he supports the ideology or they have something on him, is quite interesting. But how, I suppose the logical way of looking at this is that he obviously must have a lot of collaborators within the states helping him. These people can't be lone operators. So, I mean, how far up the food chain do you think this goes when it comes to the American establishment, or are people like him a little bit more on the outside, so to speak?
Well, just look at the list of the people on the Lolita Express and you'll understand. But if this didn't have an ideological or strategic character, right? Because America is going through changes. So you get Clinton, who basically, got rid of our tritium plants, weakened our nuclear arsenal, took away the launch codes from the submarine commanders. Why did he do that? None of that was necessary. We had been fine with all those things before. So suddenly we were buying tritium. By the end of the 90s, we're buying tritium from Russia to keep our nuclear weapons going. The Russians must have been thrilled at that, and then you have Obama with his communist background, and so how do we get these people? And then you've got Trump threatening to make Canada the 51st state, driving Carney to Beijing, who is himself part of this. He's a lefty, driving him into Beijing's arms. You've got him putting tariffs on our allies so that a communist gets elected in Australia. You've got all these countries in Europe threatened because he wants to take Greenland, and he threatens tariffs on 8 European countries over Greenland. And then he has to say, when he goes to Davos, that he's not going to invade Greenland, but that's all to destroy our alliance from within. And when he goes up against Venezuela, what does he do? He just takes Maduro and his wife. And the Venezuelan government is no regime change, and he pretends it's a regime change. I can't believe these MAGA journalists are all pretending that there was really a change in Venezuela. It was Maduro. He was the bad guy. No, Kabila, the interior minister, is worse than Maduro and much more smart. He's the king, the brain behind it all. And Delcy Rodriguez, she's not doing what Trump wants, but Trump is saying publicly he won, he controls Venezuela. And look at Iran, still, day what? That revolt, 41,000 people under death sentence, probably being executed now. Maybe 20, 30,000 people murdered in the streets. Help is on the way, storm those government buildings. There's no help on the way. People say he's going to attack any day now. Maybe, But we just saw the vice president do an interview saying, "Oh, we're not going to bomb Iran for regime change. We're going to bomb Iran to get new talks on Iran's nuclear program." You mean what Biden and Obama did? Get the Iranians to promise they won't do it anymore? Like they kept doing it anymore? What's that? That's like, and then they declare victory over that? He's going to declare victory, Trump will. So what's the real story on Trump? Is he really an American patriot? Is he really fighting America's enemies? Or is he just pretending to fight America's enemies? I submit, I think he's just pretending. He's helping Ukraine. He has no choice, but he's dragging his feet. He's embargoing 2 oil companies in Russia, not the whole oil industry. So they just shift all their oil exports to the other companies. He seized a half a dozen Russian Shadow Fleet tankers. What about the rest of the Shadow Fleet? What is this? Is Zelensky going to be undermined? Zelensky's, they don't have power through the winter. They have maybe a couple hours every other day of power in Kiev. So what's going to happen? Trump gets a few days of a ceasefire, but the Russians need the time to organize the next attack, so it's not really meaningful. This is a funny kind of game. So you have to be credible being against Russia, against Venezuela, against Iran. You have to show some credibility, but then what are the receipts at the end of the day? Have you really accomplished anything? And Russia is mobilizing 260,000 men this month. And then they're supposedly every Russian able-bodied man of military age is to go through training this year. All of them? All 10 million of them? Or is it 20 million? I don't know the exact number. It's between 10 and 20 million. And then China. We've got this supposed attempted military coup in China. Nobody knows what's really going on. Troops are moving, but they're mobilizing. Is that a smokescreen for China to mobilize too? Are China and Russia mobilizing at the same time against us? And Trump is putting up the smokescreen that he's winning these battles against Venezuela and Iran while he's causing chaos among our alliance. So I asked a question, and then you see this headline. We know Jeffrey Epstein was close to Trump at one time. I no longer believe that Trump was really not Epstein's friend. I think he had to distance himself from Epstein at some point. But he was into those girls. He was involved in this. He had to have been. Look, I'm not born yesterday, every day of the week. This is Trump. This explains Trump. This is the Russia connection that they should have been looking at back in 2017. But why didn't they look at it? The same reason nobody shut Jeffrey Epstein down. When he got arrested for that prostitution thing, it was a one-shot deal and he got a slap on the wrist. He didn't serve a real jail time. Then they couldn't cover it up. Ghislaine Maxwell is in prison. They couldn't cover up. So Jeffrey Epstein, they just offed him in jail, or some people think he was let out of jail and they made up his death. Right? That would be a neat trick. But the corruption, with this level of corruption, I mean, think about it. 2 of his guards are asleep the night he dies. He supposedly kills himself. And there's a glitch in the videotape, which Attorney General William Barr, I examined the tape. Nobody went in there, but there was a glitch. Mr. Barr, were you just incompetent? Or were you also part of it? Right? And then we go back to Iran-Contra and we find he's a CIA lawyer covering up people's tracks in that. Right? So then he ends up being George H.W. Bush's attorney general and then Trump's attorney general. What is he, a cleanup guy? What is this?
Yeah,
I don't understand. Yeah.
Yeah, Jeff, it reminds me of when you mentioned Epstein being taken out, immediately people reach for the, the more conspiratorial or Illuminati, dark elites explanation for all this, or it's the Zionists or whatever it is. But it reminds me of I think it was the Litvinenko case. I think it was over 10 years ago. I think he was taken out by Putin when he was in London, I believe, poisoned or whatever. So, and they have a long history of doing that. So it gives your thoughts on that.
Litvinenko mentioned pedophilia in terms of Putin.
Wow.
A lot of people don't know that. Shortly before Litvinenko's death, he put stuff on the internet saying that Putin was going to be a first chief directorate officer, but they found out that he was a pedophile. And Litvinenko said that his mentor in the KGB, a KGB colonel who, by the way, was murdered afterwards, told when he heard Putin in 1996 became head of the FSB, he said, oh, now they're putting the homosexuals and child molesters in charge of the service. And so Litvinenko wrote this, and he said that what they did is they realized they had to put Putin in a special unit. They put him in East Germany in counterintelligence, and they basically put him to develop these Interpol pedophile networks in the 80s. And so as these pedophile networks in Germany, especially in other countries, became more and more important, Putin would become more and more important because he would be the guy that knew how to handle those networks, right? Who to handle those people. So if they're controlling US presidents through this, like Clinton and Trump and maybe Biden and who else could be caught up in this, and European leaders and British royals, Putin's the guy that started out in this end of the business. So he's the one that's going to interact with these foreign leaders that are involved in these networks. And Putin was involved in setting up the networks. Isn't that a kind of funny coincidence? So Litvinenko writes this on the internet, and what is it? Within 100 days, he's dead, poisoned with polonium, right? So they really killed him fast. And before they killed him, they killed Anna Politkovskaya, who would have been onto this if she were alive today. She would have been. So just thinking about how much it makes sense and how many of the pieces fit together, the Illuminati, who's that? The insiders, it's always just smoke and mirrors. It's like, name your favorite villain, George Soros and stuff. Well, Soros comes out of the Eastern Bloc. He came out from behind the Iron Curtain. Who trained him? Who sent him into the West? And did he have help getting rich? Right? Trying to destroy the pound back when? Supporting all these left-wing communist causes, feeding them money? What is the Soros Fund? Is it ground zero for laundering some kind of money down there in the Netherlands Antilles? Look, we don't have proof, but these are educated guesses about important people who are subverting our country. Narcotics trafficking and the white sex trade and trade in underage girls, trafficking in underage girls. These things are related. And the fact that, look, you had the head of the parliamentary committee of inquiry into the mafia in David Remnick's book, Lenin's Tomb. You can read it there. It's towards the end of the book. This head of the parliamentary committee of inquiry into the mafia said, oh, look, Russia's the capital of international organized crime. All three of the major Italian mafias, the Calabrian, the Neapolitan, the Sicilian mafia, they go to Russia for seminars and classes on how to do money laundering and these other things better. The Russians are teaching the mafia how to do it better, and they're coordinating with them. Look, Mao said, we will make them all rich. They'll be our friends. We'll help them in their businesses, their criminal enterprises. And you know where the best intelligence, political intelligence, is on corruption and people who are on the take and willing to take more money? It's organized crime. Organized crime know which police and which mayors and which political figures are on the hook to them. And now, by butting up with organized crime, the Russian special services get all that information. The Chinese triads in Alaska, Chinese triads in Canada, You have the Sidewinder report in Canada. I don't know if you've heard of it. It was a joint study of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and the CSIS, the Canadian CIA, from 1997. And they said the Chinese are using triads, Chinese organized crime groups, to take over Canada, laundering money through urban real estate deals to buy politicians. We have to get a handle on this or we're going to lose the country. So a year ago, last September, I'm sitting next to a Canadian MP who lost her seat in the previous election because Chinese nationals were brought in to hand count the votes in her district, right? And she tells me the Chinese have already taken over the country. Go back to America, tell your friends China has taken over Canada, right? And look at Mexico. You're telling me Scheinbaum's not a communist? That there aren't the Russian embassy staff in Mexico was quadrupled or quintupled not that long ago? Why? Millions. Why are the Chinese having such a huge presence? Why are there so many Chinese in Mexico? What's going on in Mexico, right? Why is the Mexican Air Force training in Venezuela? So we're being surrounded and infiltrated. And, the lab in Las Vegas, right? Another Chinese biolab, that is a place where they make biological weapons for attacking us on our soil, like the one they found in California a couple of years back. They found this thing in Las Vegas. And guess what? The house, you can walk to the end of the block and there's a water reservoir. The drinking water is right there, right where they made this lab. A biolab. How many biolabs like that are in the U.S.? Are there hundreds of them? Why are they making them here? To attack us. What is the attack going to be about? An invasion? How do we know that? Because the defense minister, in a secret speech, Chiao Chen, the Chinese defense minister, made a secret speech in which he said, we have to exterminate the Americans and we have to take over the lower 48 states to make a second China and move millions of Chinese there. And, Colonel Stanislav Lunev said the same thing. He said, well, Russia's going to get Alaska and parts of Canada. China's going to get the lower 48 states, with other countries invited in for looting rights. Now we've got Mr. Wang, a Chinese defector, saying that his information is that the Chinese want to infiltrate 250,000 PLA troops as illegal aliens into the U.S. before the war starts, right? Before they create chaos, before something called the overture happens, massive waves of terrorism and unrest that put everything into chaos, and then come the missiles, right? Lunev told me the same thing. It's in Viktor Suvorov, a GRU defector. His real name is Vladimir Rezin. He wrote a book in the UK. He teaches at Sandhurst. He wrote a book called Spetsnaz, came out in 1987, and he said that before World War III, they would do these things. You would have gray terror. You'd have waves of violence and terror, assassinations, bombings. Things would break down. Things would be destroyed domestically, right? Well, how many arms plants have blown up? They found two at Hamburg. They found two Soviet agents. One was a Romanian national. I forget what country the other one was from. They were pouring things into the fuel tanks and the engines of German warships so they couldn't function. Right? Pretty crazy. They were going to get found out. But who on whose orders? What part of a plan is this? See, the whole West, we're all under attack. And it is a pre-war thing, because we're not going to give up all our stuff without a fight. It's a matter of weakening us so much that we just collapse when the blow is struck. Are we going to wake up? We need to wake up. And this headline about Epstein, that's a big wake-up call. Who have we elected? Who is in our parliaments and our congresses? Who are our presidents and prime ministers? And what is their background? And why did they do so many things that harm the countries they govern? Open borders, massive influxes of aliens from other countries, deindustrialization, trade with China. All these things damage us. Why are they doing it? This is the answer. This, I think, is the answer.
Yeah, fascinating stuff, Jeff. And thanks for joining us, folks. Anyone who's joining in late, make sure you do share this around and like, subscribe, all that good stuff. Jeff's blog and X profile will be flashed up on the screen. Sometimes recommend you follow him on X. Like I said, love chatting to specialists, and particularly on the historical stuff, because to be honest, I'm sorry to say this, Jeff, I have been a terrible lazy bastard over the years. I should have read more books, but I have picked up some bits and pieces. And certainly the, people who find a lot of this stuff hard to believe what we're talking about, you look at, say, Obama. We talked about Obama. I mean, he rose to be president of the United States. He kind of, learned his trade, so to speak, as, okay, he's a lifelong Marxist, but you look at him, being involved in Chicago, which is a bit of a political cesspit. It's a terrible place to be now, I hear, apparently, and in many ways. And he was kind of influenced by the likes of Saul Alinsky. So was Hillary Clinton, who tried to go for the presidency herself, was tied in with Bill Clinton. You mentioned George Soros there, and it ties into one of the problems we always face, that when people hear Soros, they will hear Jewish or Zionist, something like that, billionaire, capitalist. But you look at the causes he supports. He supports Antifa, he supports all the globalist causes. He was educated at the London School of Economics, which is another Marxist cesspit. I mean, the signs of this are everywhere. I think part of the problem is perhaps the definitions of what communism is in people's minds need to be updated. I often find them to be quite obsolete. So they see somebody who's rich and elitist, but they're not looking at the person's ideology. So a person can be a royal or, a billionaire or whatever socialite, and it's really the ideology they're pushing that is the important thing. What do you think, Jeff?
Well, the first thing is Karl Marx and Lenin, those people said communism is not an ideology because they don't believe in it. It's a method. It's a way of taking power. It's about power. That's what it is about. And getting control of history and society and people. And it's, of course, supposedly, if they get power, they're claiming they're going to do good things for us. But whenever they get power, it's just a giant way to loot and kill and dominate. It's like a bunch of psychopathic killers getting control of a country. That's what the reality of communism is. And of course, the people that want this for the future, that think that they will get control in a communist system, or they'll be respected more, and that they can do great things by making everybody equal or free, or causing the poverty to be eliminated. The lion will lie down with the lamb. There won't be wars anymore. These are among the communist dreams and promises. But when I was in graduate school, they weren't interested in reading Das Kapital, the communists. They said, look, that doesn't matter anymore. Throw out the older Marx. Marx was wrong about economics. We have to redo Marx's project. So it was the early Marx, right? It was on the Jewish question. It was Marx's the Grundrisse. It was the early Marx, the theoretical Marx, the philosophical Marx. And so they were reconstructing or reconfiguring Marxism to be more cultural, to be more in line with social controls of a society like ours. And so they knew that the old, they couldn't get the American worker to revolt. The American worker had it too good. So forget about the American worker. We're going to go after women. We're going to make them enraged at the idea that they have to bear children, that it's a kind of slavery, that it's the comfortable concentration camp of the home, right? So they created this Marxist version of feminism, which they spread everywhere. And these original feminists, they were secretly members of the Communist Party. We find out later. And so they create this, so the underclasses and the workers, it's women. And then, because that's a big group, right? And then they go after the minorities. You are black, you are Indian, you're an immigrant, you have brown skin. It's basically critical race theory, right? White people are just bad. They're racist, so they have to be replaced. We need the Communist Party USA. If you read the program, The Road to Socialism of the Communist Party USA, it is to create a majority out of women, minorities, immigrants, homosexuals, so on. And then when you get that majority and you've got the white guys in the corner, you then push past, oh so gently, the Constitution. Because the Constitution, you can't have socialism under the U.S. Constitution. You have to get rid of the Constitution. You have to have a constitutional convention. You have to somehow create a socialist system then. This is what they're aiming at. But of course, these people don't realize that the communists in Beijing and Russia, they have this thought about America. The American population is irredeemably bourgeois. If you set up a socialist constitution, they'll rebel and put capitalism back in. So we have to exterminate them. If we exterminate the Americans, none of the other countries will really give us trouble. We'll make an example out of them. China needs the lower 48 states, blah, blah, blah. So it's exterminationist when it comes to us. Because even the memory, the knowledge that a place like America could exist where people have freedom of speech, where they have the freedom to start their own business, where the idea of trading and the market are so important and we have such a good life, you can't let people know that. Because if you're going to have people on their knees all around the world for the next millennia, for the next 1,000-year, the 1,000-year reign of socialism, you can't let people know that another way exists, because they'll tear your guts out to try to get at it. And that's the truth about them. They know what they're doing.
Right, great points, Jeff. Thanks to anyone joining us late. This is my second discussion with Jeff, Mr. Jeff Nyquist. Please do share this around and subscribe, like, all that good stuff. And welcome to DM me as well if you need any some of Jeff's links as well. Some will be in the description later, and this will be uploaded in clips as well as usual. Jeff, looking at the you mentioned our chat, in our chat you mentioned Gorbachev. Now you mentioned he kind of was probably involved in this as well. Did he did he start that when he was still premier of the USSR, or was it afterwards when he kind of moved away, post perestroika and such?
Start what?
Sorry, was he involved in the sort of I think you mentioned setting up pedophilia rings or some of the research or something?
Gorbachev was a protege of Andropov. He'd been the governor of the most southernmost Russian province. He first was the agriculture minister for the Soviet Union. But Andropov was supposed to be the one to do the big changes in Russia, but he had kidney disease and died of kidney disease, so he was unable to carry it out. Andropov had been the head of the KGB. He became the head of the Soviet Union, the general secretary of the Communist Party, Soviet Union, and they needed Gorbachev to step up and fill that role. Gorbachev was not KGB, so Gorbachev didn't set up pedophilia rings. He was a Marxist-Leninist Communist Party member and Politburo member in the political establishment there. And of course, he was picked because they called him Smiling Mike, right? And he would present the image of a friendly, liberal Soviet leader, a Soviet Dubček. Dubček was a Czech leader, communist leader, who did the experiment of communism with the human face, which was one of their early experiments in what liberalization of the communist system might look like. They used Czechoslovakia's laboratory in 1968 for an experiment. This according to defector Anatoly Golitsyn. Gorbachev was then just leading the perestroika, the glasnost, the reformation of the Soviet system, which would lead, as Golitsyn predicted, to the Communist Party giving up power in the Soviet Union and the Soviet breakup. But as we know, certain things backfired on the Russians in this carrying out this strategy. But that's why they're trying to fight this war in Ukraine, to put the Soviet Union back together again. But they have not given up their plan to own the world together with their communist partners in China and other countries. Because it's a global. Marx said you have to own the whole world. It has to be a world control. Because wherever the market exists, it will destroy you. Because if people know there's a market, they'll want it. So you have to eliminate it everywhere.
That's true. Yeah, great points, Jeff. And I think that as well, like say when to just zoom in on a country, for example, and we'll just use Ireland. Like a lot of people find this stuff hard to accept, and they're always talking about the effects of globalization and, you know, the open borders and all this sort of stuff. And they're even looking at organizations like the United Nations and or the European Union, and they don't quite see that there's definitely an internationalist influence with a lot of these groups. And, you know, because the way I see it, internationalism, globalism is the idea of, you know, creating this communist idea of having a socialistic federation of the world, you know, like a collective of different member states where nations lose their indigenous culture and identity and so on. And a lot of Irish people haven't joined the dots on this stuff, I don't think, even though this is what they're actually fighting against. And when I look at a lot of the discussions, and I bring up my subject area to Irish audiences, again, you're back to the kind of, you know, limited definitions for what we're dealing with. And it's like, how do we take something that's so large and complex and multifaceted and break it down into simple messages is what question I'm posing here.
Yeah, that's always been a problem because, you know, I was Vladimir Bukovsky, the Soviet dissident. I interviewed him a year before his death, and I said, you know, they don't understand communism. And he said it's because it's complicated and they want everything to be simple. And he had tried to teach people about what it was. And he said, people, their eyes glazed over. They said, we just want the short version. We don't want to understand it. We just tell us what we need to know, and then we'll be on our way. People don't really want to study anymore. They want to go off and be entertained. So the problem is nobody ever really learned it. And it turns out the superficial learning of our conservative pundits, as Bukovsky told me, they never really understood communism. And Bukovsky told me, he said, that fake Gorbachev, they all believed in him. And there was when they were crowing about winning in 1991, when they were all crowing about winning the Cold War, William F. Buckley was stepping down from the leadership of an anti-communist organization in the U.S. And Bukovsky was the guest speaker before the group, and they were all cheering Buckley. And of course, this group was disbanding. Basically, we won the Cold War, congratulating themselves. And Buckley very politely told them, "You're just like the story of the Russian drunk, who's walking into town with a shoe on one foot and a sock on the other. And he's saying, I found a shoe. And the people are shouting back at him, no, you lost a shoe. You're missing a shoe. And so that was what he was trying to tell them, was that you haven't won the Cold War. You're a drunk and you found one shoe. That's it. And that is the problem. So, but he said that as soon as they believed this Gorbachev narrative, they all went to embrace these phony dissidents and people that were put up by the Soviet Union as liberals who were under control of the KGB, and genuine dissidents like himself and others. They weren't listened to. They were trying to warn him, don't believe in Gorbachev, don't go with this thing. And people would say to him, this is what he told me, they'd say, oh, you're just bitter. You just won't forgive and forget. Because Western elites wanted to do business in the Soviet Union. They wanted to invest there. And you can imagine if some of these people in these elites were on the hook on these pedophile rings, they were really overjoyed. No Cold War? Oh, that's a big relief to me. I'm not on the hook anymore. You know?
Yeah, I don't know if you're aware of it, Jeff, but I remember reports coming out a while ago, just again to deal with people who think that this stuff is beyond the realm of possibilities. We had reports, actually some Chinese nationals in Ireland were talking about how members of the Chinese diaspora within the country or reporting back to the Chinese Communist Party. And it came to a shock as some people. And I remember it didn't shock me, of course. And I think a Russian spy was apparently discovered in the UK Parliament, excuse me. And then as well, we had, as far back as I'm aware, the 1920s, the Americans, the Soviets infiltrating American high society and community groups and getting involved with entertainment figures and so on. So this type of stuff involved with Epstein isn't particularly new, but would I be right in saying that it would be the 1920s when was the first time America dealt with a sort of a professional sort of subversion coming from the communist side?
Yeah, well, the U.S. did not recognize the Soviet Union, but they were infiltrated immediately. And of course, the Communist Party USA was formed, the combined party formed in Chicago in 1919. So the Russians, especially when they got recognized by the Soviet Union by Roosevelt in October 1933. They had embassies and consulates to operate out of. But even in the 1920s, there's a book called Reds in America by a guy named Whitney, which documents the discovery in Michigan. The communists were meeting in Michigan in 1923, and they pretended to be a giant camp for choirs. And the local residents got a little suspicious of these meetings. So they raided the camp. They found barrels filled with documents on how to subvert your church, your city council, your county supervisors, how to, at all levels of government, how to infiltrate the school board. And it was all on practices of subversion for communists. And they were at that camp to learn these things. The Michigan State Police and the FBI were involved in this. And I'm hearing music from that. Is that Jeffrey Epstein's? That's his his fake Austrian ID. Yeah, that's another whole thing. So you see that back in the 1920s, it was happening. The subversion. Back in the 1930s, the FBI gave a report to FDR that there were something like 5,000 communists they believed working in the federal government of the United States. And Eisenhower said, "This report is nonsense. Some of my best friends are communists. What's wrong with them?" So when the House Un-American Activities Committee was first investigating Nazis and communists, Roosevelt had no trouble with them investigating Nazis, but he actually called the Texas congressman that was head of the committee into the White House to tell him to lay off the communists, right? So the Roosevelt administration was heavily infiltrated with communists. And we have all kinds of testimony on this. Diana West wrote a book called American Betrayal. And of course, a lot of it's just based on things that came out. We had defectors. Whittaker Chambers was a Communist Party member who was a courier for spy rings in Washington. So was Elizabeth Bentley. And they both defected, and they both gave testimony after World War II on how infested the government was. They named people like Harry Dexter White, who had been named by Harry Truman as the Treasury Secretary. He had basically been running the Treasury Secretary under Henry Morgenthau during the war. Harry Dexter White, they of course famously named the guy that was the opening General Secretary of the United Nations, who was Alger Hiss. He was a State Department official who was wheeling Roosevelt around at Yalta. He was named as a communist. He denied it. He ended up going to prison for perjury, and he ended up writing a book trying to exonerate himself. But we know he was, because we have the Venona decrypts, military, which we could identify certain spies. According to one scholar, Harry Dexter White, who lived in the White House and was Roosevelt's best friend was Soviet agent number 19 from the Venona decrypts. So the U.S. government was, during World War II, was massively infiltrated. And of course, this is where you get Eisenhower's deputy, General Walter Bedell Smith, who later ends up being suspected by the FBI. You've got all kinds of people. You can't begin to name Lachlan Curry. There were 2 spy rings in Washington, and it's believed there was a third one that we never found out about. They had overlapping things. So it was estimated by U.S. intelligence that there were, in working out of the White House, and the White House had thousands of employees in during the World War. In 1943, there were over 300 Soviet agents in the White House during the war. Now, you think that's just America? Look at Kim Philby and the Cambridge moles. I mean, you have the Spycatcher scandal. The head of MI5, Sir Roger Hollis, was named by his deputy, who was basically retired to Tasmania and was fed up, the Peter Wright. So there's that. And Kim Philby's famous helping other defectors get away and then getting away himself. Crazy that they let that go on, but that's the British. Well, now look at the Germans. If you read the memoirs of Reinhard Gehlen, who was a high-level military intelligence guy under Admiral Canaris, and you read the memoirs of SS Foreign Intelligence Walter Schellenberg relates how the head of the Gestapo, the head of German counterintelligence, Heinrich Müller, tried to recruit him as an agent of Stalin in 1943. It's in his memoirs. So the head of German counterintelligence during the war, a Nazi, general basically, who was very close to Hitler, was a Soviet agent. And of course, it's come out since, there's a lot of evidence that Hitler's right-hand man, Martin Bormann, was a Soviet agent. And of course, I've talked to former OSS, CIA guys, old guys in there, and yeah, they knew this, that Hitler was surrounded by Soviet agents. No wonder he lost the war. But then, no wonder when the Germans had their last panzer divisions, they gathered them all up, and who did they attack in December 1944? They attacked the Americans. The Battle of the Bulge, the Ardennes Offensive. It was we, the Americans, who fought that last bloody battle with the Germans, because the Germans threw everything. Why did Hitler throw everything at the Americans? Either he was influenced by Martin Bormann and these other communists around him, agents around him, or he made a deal with Stalin at the end of the war. Right? So all of this history of they penetrated Hitler's government, a totalitarian government at war. They infiltrated Roosevelt's government. They infiltrated British intelligence. Where can't they go? This is without using without using a pedophile honey trap, right? It's without using that. So now you add this to it and you think, how much worse does it get? I think we're in deep trouble. But we have to be honest before we can deal with this. We have to be honest about it. We have to look at it with clear eyes. We have to be finally honest. It's painful because we all want to believe that everything's hunky-dory, everything's wonderful, right? We just want to believe that. So we want to, poo-poo, that's just paranoid nonsense. We've got a long history here of communist penetrations, communist subversion, and we're taught that it's just paranoid nonsense. And look at the headline. It's a Daily Mail. Look at what the intelligence services, and how many people in the intelligence services are bad. There's an allegations now against the American DNI, Tulsi Gabbard. And she's being criticized for keeping it in a safe. Well, what is the allegation against her? It's said to be serious. Well, she was a Bernie girl. She's got her own socialist background, right? DSA and the rest of it. These are communists, basically. So Trump appointed a communist to be director of national intelligence. Is that who Tulsi Gabbard is? She goes before communist groups. She gives the message. Now MAGA has been moved so close into communism that she can go before a conservative group, give almost the same speech and be applauded. That puts new meaning to the term convergence. Remember Andrei Sakharov? Convergence. How do you converge the left and the right? Right? Going back to Khrushchev's speech, we need to make anti-communist organizations in the United States that we control, that changes the narrative. So it's the Jews, right? Not the communists. It's Israel. It's the Mossad, right? That's what they want everybody to think. Jeffrey Epstein was Mossad. No, he isn't. Look at the headline. He's meeting with Putin and he's Mossad. He's getting girls from Russia and he's Mossad. The people that he's associated with are supporting a president that's trying to break up NATO, and he's with Mossad? I wonder. We need to ask these questions. Okay, people say, all right, Nyquist, you're going to be proved wrong. Let's see how this shakes down. This year, 2026, is the important year. So anyway, do people have questions? Do we want to do question and answer?
Yeah, I'll take a look at the comments now, Jeff, on our next time you are doing an answer, I'll have a look. And just checking, by the way, time wise, do you need to wrap up soon, or you another interview lined up? I think just checking.
Well, I've got an interview at 3, so I'm good for an hour and a half.
Okay, no worries, great. What you said there just remind me. So I'll have a look at the questions in a moment. But you know how we're those of us who are probably at least aware of what you're talking about, that there is this kind of internationalist movement. They are conspiratorial. They have a lot of experience with this stuff. The professional level penetration of Western nations goes back, over 100 years or thereabouts, maybe even further back than that when you look at the socialist groups, the labour union movements in Ireland and elsewhere as well. And really it's something to behold in terms of how good they are at it. I remember as well, I think that you had the OSS in Office of Strategic Services in World War II. It was after that the CIA was formed, and the Comintern were already at it since 1919 or early 1920s at least. So I think people are really way behind on this, and you look at, say, another thing as well is they give you some clues. So we were talking about Putin last day, virtue signaling, talking about how the West is being controlled by evil bourgeoisie, pedophiles and so on. He's sitting there with this smug look on his face. To me, it was almost like a giveaway. It was almost like priming the audience, talking about Western Satanists. And this happened pretty much just before the Epstein situation kind of emerged in a big way. So, am I onto something here or what?
Oh, yeah. No. See, this is how they play it. They create the problem in our society by their sabotage of our society, by their active measures, and then they come up with the solution. Putin's a conservative, don't you know? He's a Christian, don't you know? He's going to fight the satanic pedophiles in the West. So then you got Tucker Carlson coming up saying, yeah, Putin's a good guy. There's a coup in Kiev, and the Ukrainians are evil, and Zelensky is an evil, they're trafficking Ukrainian women, and all these other narratives, right, come up. And so they just flip everything around. They flip reality around so that people go, yeah, our guys, you got Owen Schroyer, the sidekick of Alex Jones, saying a couple of years ago that China and Russia are the good guys and America is the bad guys. He's a young American guy. He's saying his own country is evil. You've got all these women on YouTube saying, cursing MAGA and saying, we hope you rot and you die and you're all evil. So that what wins if I call this bowling pin, it's the scissor strategy, but I call all of these MAGA leaders bowling pins. They've all been set up to be knocked down. The reason you set up a bowling pin is you're going to roll a bowling ball at it and knock it down. So they're just setting up all these people as bowling pins. Trump is a setup to knock down conservatism. He's blackening the name of conservatism, and he's not a conservative. He's on his third marriage. He was a playboy. He was supporting the Soviet program in his newspaper adverts that he bought in the 1980s after he visited the Soviet Union. He was just spouting the Soviet line back then, So he runs as a Republican, And he promises all these things. I mean, look at his speech. We're going to land a man on Mars, he even said. Puff all the Americans up, fill them up with pride. And what ends up happening? How does it end up? We're gonna own Greenland. We're gonna pay $700 billion for Greenland, and we're gonna bully Denmark to the bargain. Little Denmark, the country that's one of the most pro-American countries in Europe, and he's really giving them a sock in the jaw, right? Oh, they're too small to control Greenland. Well, what is Greenland? You're gonna give $700 billion for that lump of ice? It's worthless. And he acts like, oh, it's all so valuable and we need it to defend America while he alienates Canada. So Greenland's going to defend America while Canada is going against us. How does that work exactly? It's just madness. And people uncritically just accept what they hear, which is really outrageous to me. And I wish people would just smarten up, but they don't. Every word I speak, I get fewer listeners, by the way, because it turns out people don't want to know these truths. They are themselves already compromised and corrupted in their minds. This is the power of Soviet active measures. And they will remember these words if I made them hurt enough right now, if I made them feel bad enough that they won't listen. But in so many months, when things get worse, they're going to wish they had this interview available to listen to it again. Because it's going to get worse, people. It's going to get a lot worse.
I agree with your
prediction. Sorry.
Yeah. I agree with your assessment, Jeff. I mean, I coming at this from a different angle over the last few years, particularly, or when I start putting the book together. I mean, if the problem is the thing that's causing all the trouble globally is communism, but people don't even know what it is. They can't even define it. Never mind find out who's involved with it and who's pushing this stuff and how to spot somebody. I think the chances of us stopping this thing, or at least getting a handle on the situation, are just slim, just from a problem-solving point of view. And by the way, I actually wanted to ask you on, I noticed for a while looking at Trump, I never looked at him the way you're kind of talking about, in a way maybe he's involved wittingly or unwittingly or whatever. But the fact that he does the communists, it looks to me like the communists clench fist. Or am I looking at that wrong? Is that a Republican thing, or why does he do that? It's pretty bizarre.
I mean, Nixon's thing was to do this, right? Borrowed from Churchill, it means victory. Right. And then the communists turned this into means peace. So they ruined it, because then it was not victory, it was defeat. The communist 60s radicals used Nixon's own little victory sign and inverted it so that, of course, to mean the peace sign. And that was just a way of breaking that, So we lost the Vietnam War after Nixon resigned after Watergate. All those countries went communist. The domino theory? No, it's domino history. How many countries continue to become communist? How many continue to fall to the Russians? We're going to let Ukraine fall? It's another domino. They played this trick where they gave us the poison pawn. They pulled out of Eastern Europe, and they were hoping their networks would hold everything down. Then they believed they had enough control in the West. Look at Epstein. Look at what Maxwell set up, all the front companies, Soviet front companies he set up before his suspicious death. They created all that because they figured we can give up Eastern Europe for now because we've got to exploit these important positions in the West. And it didn't quite work out the way they wanted, but still they're pushing. They've got Venezuela, they've got Iran, they've got, all these people on the hook. Keir Starmer running to China, Albanese in China's pocket, Carney in Canada running to Beijing to become a strategic partner of the Chinese communists. Again, strategic encirclement of the United States.
Absolutely. And I was thinking, Jeff, if you wanted to shoot, I know you're busy, you got another interview, so you wanted to shoot for the top of the hour, if that's okay. So
Yeah,
another like 20 minutes or so. And what I could
sure.
do is I could, I've got a question of my own, and I've got a question from one of the current listeners and a question from a listener the other day. So my first one is, because you know how I focus on the ideology a lot and the brainwashing and so on, and people even identifying this stuff. We're talking about the ICE shootings and say the Venezuela thing or the Greenland thing or the Canada thing. There's all these signs that the international communist movement is involved, but many people aren't spotting this. And America, one of the habits I noticed, in my opinion, is people use the term liberal and liberals or liberalism when they're dealing with what I see to be Marxist fanaticism or activism on the streets. It could be BLM or, the counter protests with the ICE activities. So, I mean, how do you kind of deal with this? And do you think that perhaps that there needs to be kind of a type of an awakening in America where people start to modify how they're looking at this?
Yes, because the word liberal, again, if a word is considered good, the Chinese Chinese and the Russians, the communists want to appropriate that word. They want to corrupt it. See, because controlling language, taking over the good words, is important for them. This is part of the linguistics that Stalin got interested in towards the end of his life. If we control the language that people use, we will control. So, what was a liberal? Abraham Lincoln was a liberal, right? So liberalism, it comes from liberty, freedom. And it has a certain meaning. It's pro-capitalist, a real liberal, and so they end up making that word. Communists in the U.S. start applying that word to themselves, and they start calling themselves progressives. I mean, Teddy Roosevelt was a progressive, right? It's a good thing to be for progress. So they take that word. So then you hear people saying, well, I'm a liberal and I'm a progressive, and you look at their policies and they're socialists. Well, why don't they call themselves socialists? Well, the reason is socialism scares people. When they get to know what it is, of course, that's why they've educated a new generation not to be afraid of that word. But people will always become afraid of that word when they realize what socialism means. That it means that they're going to live in poverty and that they're going to have no freedom of speech or freedom to buy and sell, and that everything's going to be controlled by a narrow elite that's going to exploit everybody. The old Soviet joke, what is the definition of capitalism? Man exploiting man. What is the definition of communism? Just the reverse, right? Except that under capitalism, we have a much better life. There's no utopia. This idea that they're telling people everything's so bad, you need a different system. There is never, in the history of mankind, there haven't been better ones than we have. Despite the pedophiles, despite everything else, we need to preserve the market. We need to preserve freedom. We need to preserve checks and balances in our government. We don't need communism. Communism and socialism are not checks and balances. Checks and balances are liberalism and conservatism, and basically both came out of the Whig Party in the UK, what was then Great Britain. Edmund Burke and so on was the great granddaddy of conservatism. Well, he was a Rockingham Whig. They could also be called liberals later on. So the ideology of the American Whig Party, Lincoln was a Whig before the Republican Party came along. So these are labels that belong to a period of unprecedented freedom and real progress that now the communists have appropriated. So now we're calling communists liberals, and we're calling conservatives far right radicals, right? Nazis. Isn't that funny?
The whole deflection tactics and conspiracy galore, even in the terms that they use, and you said it there, it's pretty much like virtue signaling. They use language in a way to present themselves as being nice. And I remember in my presentation I included a quote. Well, it was kind of a quote paraphrased by Bella Dodd, you know, the one Alexander Trachtenberg in I think it was in the 20s or thereabouts, maybe a bit later, when he talked about how the language that they use going forward, right? They predicted back then, talking about using the term progressive and liberal, and it's been so effective. And I have been trying to say that to American audience whenever I've done spaces or interviews, that, you know, how you label them is key here, because I think the term liberal, like I always say, Jeff, liberalism was never an internationalist nuclear weapons powered ideology that's killed you know, tens of millions of people. That's an expert, that's subversion and conspiracy and stuff. There's a massive difference between those movements.
Well, you know, Confucius and Socrates and Plato and many Western philosophers, and also Cato the Younger during the troubled times of the Roman Republic, they all said that the key to saving civilization, to preserving society, was to the rectification of language. That is, Cato said, you must give things their proper name. You must call things by their proper name. Confucius said that. Rectification begins by calling things by their proper name. What do communists do? They corrupt language, so that, and the Nazis did this too, so that you do not call things by their proper names. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's a good one. And of course, a lot of the viewers will be familiar with stuff like, you know, the cisgender and, you know, and all these different terms they come up with to deflect away from what they're up to. The question... Yeah, they just, seem to be all the flavors you can think of pretty much, and in terms of the language they use. But my friend Victor here, thanks for watching, Victor. Appreciate your help earlier as usual. Anyone listening, myself and Victor will be doing a space on X with some friends tomorrow night, so please do join us. Victor had a question. I think it's something you mentioned earlier, Jeff. It was he said, who was the man that said the head of the CIA was a Russian agent? Was that I think that's something you mentioned earlier. Maybe it's one of the whispers.
That was in a book called Wedge by Mark Riebling. He goes into declassified files. They were declassifying things in the late 80s and the 90s, around the end of the Cold War. And what he stumbled on was, and it's in the book, that there were two agents. One was General Walter Bedell Smith had been, before he was head of the CIA, he was our ambassador to the Soviet Union. And there was a guy that worked in that embassy who was, the FBI believed he was a Soviet spy. And Walter Bedell Smith sort of tried to cover for him. And then there was a second case of someone, I believe it was in the CIA, that again, Smith's covered for this guy. So the FBI began to look at Smith, and they began to find things. Not sure, because his file is still classified, his full file, FBI file. And so they sort of look at him, and then Riebling recounts that they went to President-elect Eisenhower before his inauguration in January 1953 and said, Ike, you know, this guy used to be your deputy in Schaeff during World War II, because Walter Bedell Smith was Eisenhower's immediate deputy, his second. And he said, you've got to get him out of the CIA. He's fallen under suspicion. And you have to promise him a job in the State Department or somewhere else so that he resigns, because we have a mess here. And so Eisenhower agreed, and he said, look, you know, Smith, I've got a good thing for you, a better thing for you at the State Department. So Smith maybe thought he was going to be Secretary of State or something. I don't know what. And then he was just dropped after that. They took his security clearance away. The FBI went through a period of months where they thought, well, maybe Smith isn't guilty. But then in May of 1953, according to Riebling, they found something that made them convinced. Then Riebling recounts that Smith, when he died, I think he died in 61 or 62, they found loads of classified documents in Smith's home, which he shouldn't have had in his home, because his security clearances had been yanked, and he wasn't supposed to take those documents home. And of course, we've had that problem with people like Biden, other people who brought classified documents home. But this was Smith. So Riebling leaves us with the strong suspicion that Smith was a Soviet agent. And of course, it was a real mistake to leave Smith's deputy, Alan Dulles, in charge, because Smith had picked him. Why would Smith pick Alan Dulles? Well, James Angleton said, and this is in Joseph Trento's book. Sorry, I need to get some water here. Joseph Trento did interviews with James Angleton, the head of the CIA counterintelligence staff, about these things. And Angleton then confessed, and he was dying of lung cancer at the time, that in order to be head of counterintelligence staff, Alan Dulles made him promise he would not polygraph or question Alan Dulles and 60 of his friends. And he realized these guys had compromised themselves with the Nazis during the war, and the Soviets knew about it. And that's in the book. I mean, that's in that's in Trento's book, and he's got James Angleton's words quoted there, and that's towards the end of that book. So, and the testimony doesn't end there. I mean, you read the history of intelligence, and these things. You've got the book Lamia, but that was a code name of a French agent who was confronted with around the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis when Golitsyn defected. Golitsyn was a KGB guy who defected in December 1961, and he said the Soviets are going to tell their agents in France to tell their agents in America to spy on America's ICBM and nuclear weapons programs. That is, the KGB had control over the French, so much control over the French intelligence service, they were going to get their own agents to spy on the U.S. for them. And so this Lamia, he was a major French liaison agent working with the FBI and the CIA. And he said, well, I haven't received those orders. This defector's not credible. So they go, well, just go home and find out what you can find. The CIA guys asked him, because we want to know if this defector is legit. So Lamia goes home, and what do? They call him in and they order him to spy on the American nuclear program. And he's like stunned, right? He goes back to the Americans and says, I need to leave the French service. You have to protect me. They want me to spy on you now. And President Kennedy tried to call Charles de Gaulle to say his intelligence service was infiltrated, and de Gaulle just basically hung up on him. Wouldn't listen to him, right? And of course, President Kennedy was killed by who? Oswald, the communist. See, what Trento tells us is Bobby Kennedy was basically put in charge of the CIA after the Bay of Pigs. They didn't trust any of those people, and they were looking for what? Moles. Bobby Kennedy was working with Angleton, but they couldn't look at that. They did fire Casey. I don't know what they did with the other people, but by then the CIA was just useless. It was completely penetrated, right? But read the literature, read the spy memoirs, the honest ones, and read the defector literature. Golitsyn, Shana, Bittman. We got the Cold War wrong. Spycatcher by Peter Wright, which you can't get in Britain. I think still now it's they don't allow it to be printed there, right? Maybe you can get a copy in Ireland. There's probably pirated copies in Britain, but Margaret Thatcher made it illegal to own that book in Britain. I think it came out in 1987. Yeah. Why? Because the deputy head of MI6 who had retired accused his boss, deputy head of MI5 accused his boss, Roger Hollis, of being a Soviet agent. And guess what? A number of researchers came out later and said, yeah, he was. We've got the receipts on him. Right? And that's not, MI6, it was Kim Philby and the Cambridge moles. So both services of the British got penetrated. Kim Philby was, by the way, in line to be the head of MI6 until he gave himself away by covering for these other moles. So we're penetrated. Let's be realistic. If that happened back then, you think we're more strict and have better discipline and have more honest people now than we did in the 40s and 50s? I don't think so. I don't think morality's been getting better the last half century or more. Do you?
No, this is...
Yeah, there's Jeffrey Epstein. Look at him. What was he up to? Oh, I lost your sound.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, this is so big, and people need to get going with learning the nature of the beast. Anyone watching in, make sure you check out Jeff's blog as well. I'll flash it up on screen for us. Some great articles there, and I'd only keep you all day, Jeff. I know you got another one lined up, but just one more thing, a kind of small topic here. I have one of our viewers, Alex, who I believe is from Hong Kong. I'm not sure, but he wanted to ask you a question about the Hong Kong, I suppose, liberation movement in there. And we know obviously there's been quite a history there, because I can't remember the year, but it was under the control of the British for a while, and they've obviously had to deal with the communists and so on. But he was saying that essentially the Hong Kong liberation or freedom movement was controlled by elements of the CCP. So kind of what we were talking about before, of them co-opting excuse me, other groups, are controlling the so-called opposition. So any information for us on that one?
Yeah, that's an important point that I didn't. There's so many things that this raises that I missed. People don't realize one of the techniques that the communists use to keep control in their regimes is controlled opposition movements, and this is when the Bolshevik regime was winning the Civil War in 1921. It was basically won, and was over sometime in 22. I mean, there was scattered fighting here and there, but after that, Lenin created something called the New Economic Policy, which meant that, they just created the Soviet Union at the end of the Civil War. The Soviet Union was going to liberalize. They were going to have a free market. That Lenin didn't know how to build communism. Well, parallel with this, they created a secret organization. Well, it already existed. They'd captured it. It was a white Russian intelligence organization. They renamed it the Trust. It was the it was called the Alliance of Central Russia, or something like that. And it was, of course, I think it had arisen under Kolchak or Denikin, and it was an anti-communist organization. The communist services took over because they captured the people that ran it. The Reds did, and so they decided to run this anti-Bolshevik organization themselves. And it was called the Trust because they met in a bank in Moscow, and they started to reach out to the West with agents saying, we lost the Civil War, but the agents of the Trust have the Monarchist Alliance of Central Russia, it was called. We have taken over the Bolshevik regime from within. We have basically infiltrated their secret services. We've turned their generals. We're infiltrating the Red Army. We're infiltrating the government. There's a reason that Lenin has declared to go back to the market economy. Communism is dead in the Soviet Union. And they put this message out. And they delivered secrets about Russia. They smuggled people out of the country. They got people released from jail. They convinced all the Western services came to believe this was true, that Russia was no longer really communist, that the Trust had taken everything over. And it wasn't until it was 1928 or 29, one of the leaders of the Trust defected to Finland. And he told Finnish intelligence, by the way, the Trust is an operation of the Cheka. We were always in control of it. And they were shocked. And then he redefected back to Russia and resumed his job in the office. So they basically told everybody, ha ha, we fooled you. For the last 8 years, we had tricked you. And you believed everything. And then they arrested all Sidney Riley was a British agent operating in the Soviet Union. He got arrested. Others got captured. They basically executed Savinkov. Well, I think he fell out of a window, right? This was one of the white generals that had returned to Russia under the belief that the Trust was a good thing. So Stalin brought the Trust to an end, right? Just like Putin is bringing the perestroika and glasnost to an end, has brought it to an end. They repeated this, the controlled opposition. So the Soviet Union created, when Poland first became communist, they created a fake Polish Home Army. And it was Operation Win. And Operation Win, it was to convince the West to pour gold and resources. They ultimately wanted an American general to parachute into Poland to lead the revolt against communism. And what they did after they sucked as many guns and arms and money out of the West as they could, they did a ha-ha broadcast. We controlled the whole thing ourselves. And they assassinated people. They blew up their own trains. They did incredible things to themselves to create the impression that there was kind of like a mini civil war going on in Poland to lure the Western services. And then we have Gorbachev. We have all these dissident organizations, Andrei Sakharov. We have a charter, what was it called? We had Lech Walesa in Poland, who Polish dissidents were telling me was a communist agent, like Walesa, and it came out in court. A former member of the Polish secret police said, yeah, he was an agent of the secret police, like Walesa was. Same thing out of Czechia. You've got Robert Bukar's film about the Velvet Revolution. He interviews the STB agent that impersonated the student who was supposedly killed, who's commemorated every year. They celebrate the Velvet Revolution in Czechia, right? It was all fake. He said the orders came from Moscow. Ceausescu was just a dictator who was expendable because he wouldn't step down like the others. So it was, and you got Andrew Codrescu writes about it in a book called The Hole in the Flag. He says the revolution in Romania was orchestrated by Soviet agents close to Gorbachev in the Romanian system. He wasn't overthrown by the people of Romania. Codrescu is very clear about that. It was just made to look that way. He was overthrown by the Russians, right? So they wanted to make the changes. If they couldn't get the revolutions to happen, they engineered them themselves. Then Gorbachev brings the flag down on Christmas Day, 1991, over the Kremlin. It was all a trick. This is controlled opposition. And so Hong Kong, you get to Hong Kong, the British have a guarantee that Hong Kong is going to remain free to the middle of the century. They want it now. So what did they do? They infiltrated the democracy movement in Hong Kong. They used their own agents, and they led them into these protests that they could, with the scissor strategy, react against the hooliganism, right? And they could basically start eliminating young people. We don't know how many people they killed in Hong Kong. And people got the message and they fled, and then the empty houses, they just filled with mainland Chinese agents who they then filtered into New Zealand, Australia, Canada, other Commonwealth countries. All these operations are very useful. Controlled opposition is useful for infiltrating the enemy, for everything. Controlled opposition. Imagine how they penetrated the white diaspora, the white Russian diaspora after the Civil War by creating this fake, by taking over this monarchist alliance of Central Russia and turning it into this fake controlled, anti-Bolshevik movement. They basically were able to, and it destroyed the hope of the white Russians to ever come back. Because who could they trust? They were so thoroughly infiltrated. It demoralized them. So nobody could reignite the Russian Civil War. So I'm glad he mentioned that. Hong Kong is just another example of the same pattern of subversion and control, and it's a very big example of controlled opposition, yes.
Excellent stuff. Thanks very much, Jeff, and great to get your insights as usual. And just let us know about the blog website as well. What's your latest article, and just give us the name of the blog as well.
Yeah, it's a series on the end of NATO that I'm doing. There's several articles. It's the second one, and it's about whether this is, it goes into the problems with the CIA, the problems with our own intelligence, and the Epstein affair, and what it means, and what in relation to what Trump is doing. And I'm just trying to point out, I've got a lot of footnotes. I footnote my articles, so if people want to find where I'm getting things from, they can go and find those books. But it's these things are really happening, and I want to, by writing it, I want to lay it all out so people can see it. It's very difficult to do because there's so many moving parts on this, but it's helpful if people can use it as a reference. And I encourage people to read and also to buy my book or books. You go to Amazon or the P.O. Box. I've got a book that's almost out of print that was sort of my workbook, The Origins of the Fourth World War. It was really written in the late 80s and early 90s, where I mapped out where I thought all this was going, because I really learned about this by reading the defector literature. And of course, it's all fallen into place just like the most important defectors said it would. We're seeing all the elements. It's like these guys were prophets talking about the long-range strategy and where Russia and China were going.
Brilliant stuff. Thanks very much, Jeff. I always appreciate talking to you, and it's a real honor. And I hope the viewers watching back or watching live get a lot from all this and just start to really, engage with this subject and start to look at things in a new way. So just stick around for a moment or two, Jeff, and just close out the show here, if that's okay. Thanks very much.
Great.
Thank you. Okay, folks, thanks very much for watching. I am back tomorrow night with an X Space with some pals of mine. I'll be doing an interview over the weekend with someone involved with the Irish nationalist movement and some other bits and pieces as well. So the website is resolvingor.com. The website is Resolving Reality. Make sure you give us a like, subscribe, all that good stuff. Make sure you follow me on X @resolvingor, and I will see you soon in the next